and it hits me, oh my gosh, this is that triangle.
You know, there's explanation for everything that occurred in the Rendlesham Forest incident that doesn't involve aliens at all.
It was completely silent. It comes right over our heads.
He saw a classic flying saucer, really, standing in the clearing.
He turned over to my father and held his hand, and he looked in his eyes, and he said, "We're not alone."
Welcome to Podcast UFO for our live show. We're live every Wednesday at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on the Dark Matter Radio Network. Please remember to visit the website podcastufo.com for past episodes, blogs, and forums. During the show, feel free to participate live in our chat room. And don't forget to like us on our very active Facebook page.
Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Martin Willis, your host. We have a great show for you tonight with Dr. Ron Westrum. I met Ron last year at the North Carolina UFO convention. I really loved what he had to say. We do have a clip from Andy Fleming coming up, and he's going to take a look at our Galactic Center. That'll be up in just a second. I want to thank Michael Lauk last week for filling in for me. I was moving. I was without internet. And he came in at the last minute. He did a stellar job. And if you missed it and you miss Michael on the show, because he used to be our newscaster, you can go to our website, podcastufo.com, and listen to the podcast from last week. He did a great job. Well, speaking of news and newscasters, I seem to be burning through them. John Tobin says he has too much on his plate, and he's no longer our newscaster. So I may ask our guest tonight, who's a sociologist, on what I'm doing wrong. Maybe I should stop abusing newscasters. I don't know what it is. I may talk about a few things about the news myself instead of having a newscaster. And as a matter of fact, I'm going to talk about U.S. former President Bill Clinton was on the Jimmy Kimmel Show. Please check out our video in our show notes. Kimmel basically said the first thing that he would do if elected was ask what the heck is going on with UFOs. And Clinton really has some good points. It's pretty interesting. He was one of the presidents that actually looked into the subject. Well, hang on for just a second. We're going to listen to Andy Fleming and what he has to say about our Galactic Center.
And hi, Martin and listeners. And today I'm talking about the latest news about Sagittarius A star, which you'll remember from last week, is the supermassive black hole at the centre of our galaxy. Now, in the coming weeks, astronomers may see this monster having a cosmic snack. The gas cloud called G2 is in the process of colliding with it. G2 has a mass of 3 Earths and is no match for Sagittarius A star, which has the mass of 4 million suns. Imagine that. If the black hole devours much of the cloud, fireworks could ensue. Heated to billions of degrees as it spirals inward, the doomed gas cloud may emit a last gasp of radiation from across the electromagnetic spectrum. Even if the encounter proves a dud, it may still provide an insight about the feeding habits of supermassive black holes. The first stage could come just weeks after the cloud, already stretched into a spaghetti-like strand by the black hole's gravity, makes its closest approach to Sagittarius A star. At closest approach, the cloud's distance from the black hole will still be about 200 times Earth's distance from the Sun. Nonetheless, the passage might be near enough for G2 to plough into the outer edge of the swirling disk of matter, believed to surround and feed the black hole. The shockwave generated by that encounter may create X-rays and radio waves that could be detected by telescopes. If the cloud contains a star at its centre, as some astronomers have proposed, it may produce a stronger shock and generate more light. The encounter could have another effect. Disruptions in the cloud might alter the direction in which the radio waves vibrate as they travel through space. Simultaneous observations with telescopes tuned to different radio wavelengths have a chance of discerning the wave's twists, giving astronomers new details about the cloud's properties. But most of the potential fireworks are perhaps decades away. Moreover, astronomers think that if the gas cloud is to be swallowed, it will have to lose much of its angular momentum or orbital rotation around the black hole. Next year, the Event Horizon Telescope that has already examined Sagittarius A star will gain enough resolution to discern the light that just misses being dragged into Sagittarius A star, but is bent by the black hole's gravity into a halo that frames it. Now, this is important because deviations from the predicted shape of the halo would indicate that Einstein's theory of gravity needs revision.
Well, I always like hearing from Andy. And like Michael said last week, it's good to hear him talk about anything. Our upcoming guest is Ron Westrum. He's an Emeritus Professor of Sociology at the Eastern Michigan University, holding an honors BA from Harvard in Social Relations and a PhD from the University of Chicago in Sociology. Dr. Westrum is a specialist on sociology of science and technology, and he's developed an interest in UFOs, and we're here to talk about that. How you doing, Ron?
I'm very well, thank you, Martin.
Thanks for joining us. And last year I listened to you at the conference and really loved what you had to say. And it's interesting when you actually dive back into the history and the whole sociological scheme of how things are suppressed and all that. Can you, first of all, it always interests me, and I think interests a lot of our listeners, to find out what makes someone like you in the field you're in have an interest in UFOs.
Well, I think it's almost the other way around in the sense that I've been interested in UFOs as far back as I can remember. And so as I begin to acquire the rudiments of sociological knowledge, I began to think, well, what can I do with the sociological knowledge I have to help elucidate the UFO problem? And it took many years to figure that out, actually. But I think that probably that what I've done with the issue of hidden events has been a tremendous help to me in understanding the UFOs and also, of course, society's attitudes toward UFOs.
Oh, wow.
So, yeah. So what I've tried to do, basically, is I looked at UFOs as an example of a class of events, and this class of events is called hidden events. And what happened is that I began to look for other situations like UFOs where there was essentially hidden knowledge, where people had seen things and didn't feel comfortable in coming forward with them, where science was not particularly interested in hearing about things that didn't agree with its already decided nature of reality. Mm-hmm. And so that's what I did. I began to research things like the meteorite controversy in the 18th century. I looked at the battered child syndrome actually in some detail, and have spent a lot of time looking at some of the more familiar anomalies like Bigfoot and sea serpents and so forth, and also at some of the more obscure ones like spontaneous human combustion.
Oh, that for some reason that's always fascinated me. I know right. This is a UFO show, but I guess the bottom line is, do you know if that's real? Does that really happen?
Well, yes, I think it does. In fact, I got a very interesting letter from a scenes of crime officer in England who said that he had been involved in a case like this, where it was, in his account, essentially indisputable that there had been essentially spontaneous human combustion. But he said the police department was really not very interested in exploring that possibility. And if we had more time, I'd tell you about all the forensic pathologists in England who have, varying opinions on this subject, most of them negative. But nonetheless, the evidence seems to be very strong. And of course, there was I'm forgetting which Charles Dickens novel this was in, but he actually mentioned spontaneous human combustion in the novel, and that's how one of the characters dies.
Wow. Now, do you think, with your background, is the thing that comes to mind for me is fear, is what controls how people try to regulate what they know. And, for instance, let's just say human origin. There's always controversy on, part of evolution and how long the human form as we know it, modern Homo sapien, has been here. And then when anything is sort of controversial discovered to that, it's like, either kept quiet or the person loses their career. Or is this like all based on fear, or what is it that makes science so rigid in this manner?
Well, that's a good question. Let's deal with a more familiar case, the head of Brontosaurus. When the first Brontosaurus skeleton was discovered, they couldn't find a head right away. But they found one 10 miles away and decided that was the Brontosaurus head. And that, of course, is a familiar sort of bulldog shape that all of us have grown up with. And Sinclair Oil used in their advertising campaigns and so forth.
Yep.
Well, some years later, they found a skeleton with the head, basically, or a head that was much, much closer. And it looked more like Diplodocus, okay? And so there's a very interesting story, and it was told, actually, I think it's Saturday Review, about how the powers that be to block the knowledge of this second head. Part of the problem was, by the way, they had taken one of the Brontosaurus skeleton they had, and they made copies of it and sent it to a bunch of different museums, okay? They had plaster casts, okay? Well, if you had a plaster cast of Brontosaurus, of course, the last thing in the world you want to do is have to change it. Scientific authorities lined up in favor of suppression instead of in favor of open discussion on this. And it literally took, I think, something like 50 or 70 years before this finally got corrected.
Wow. In some ways, people are so primitive, and in other ways, when you think of, you go back to astronomy and Galileo, and it always comes to the point where they're under pressure when they discover something that's new or different. And before we go any further, just if you're listening live, please jump over to the podcast UFO 12 sign in on our chat room, and you're welcome to pose questions to our guest this evening. So, as far as any of the studies that you have done on the UFO subject, can you talk a little bit about that?
Of course. Sure. Well, UFOs are a perfect example of a hidden event because, of course, we know that basically most of the time when people see UFOs, they don't report them. Mm-hmm. But what's even more interesting, it's even in cases like the Chicago O'Hare case where this UFO made a hole in the cloud. The level of uneasiness and the level of suppression is really quite amazing. I'm not sure in whose interest this was waged and so forth, but it's fairly difficult to deny something that made a circular hole in a cloud, especially when flight crews and so on have seen this thing. So, what was in it, basically, for people trying to suppress this, except that nobody wanted to be questioned about something that was considered to be unusual, counterintuitive, impossible, and so on and so forth.
Right. I had talked to Leslie Kane about that, and one of the things I think about is, I think it was United Airlines, was it? And Gate C5 or whatever it was. But you just wonder when these people, their career is going to last so long, or these people that were witnesses is what I'm talking about, mm-hmm. that kept hush-hush. Eventually, I would think that someone's going to come forward and say, hey, look, I don't work for the airline anymore, and I want to talk about this. You'd think that would happen sooner or later.
Well, yeah, think about the Phoenix Lights and how long it took the governor to come forward and say that he had actually seen the. Yes, I mean that's the that's the level we're talking about here, and by that point, basically everybody had sort of forgotten about this thing and written it off. Mm-hmm. And so that's the deal: is that often it's when people retire or they, for whatever reason, they're put beyond the threat of censure or whatever it is, but that's it. And many times they simply sit on the information.
Yeah, you see that over and over again. We have a question on the chat room, again, not totally related to UFOs at all, or possibly, who knows. So is it reasonable to conclude that information surrounding the pyramids has been altered, then fed to the public?
Confucius said something very important, and he said, "When you don't know, you keep your mouth shut." And I really don't know enough about this to give a coherent answer.
Absolutely, yeah. It's just one of the wonders and one of the mysteries of how that could possibly be built. As I don't think it could be built today. I've heard that said before. They don't have the machinery that could actually create the pyramids.
Well, I do know that the pyramids were certainly constructed in an absolutely amazing way in the sense that people couldn't insert a knife between two of these giant blocks. And I really have no idea how the ancients did this, but it may simply be arrogance on our part that we think they were stupid.
Yeah, that's right. Going back to, you're talking about the Phoenix Lights. That is one of the examples I bring up quite a bit because of the amount of witnesses and the suppression, and I think that's kind of along the lines of what you study is like, why do people suppress and why do they hide? And that, besides the governor, there was a lot of other suppression. There was the Air Force saying, it was flares. They did set off flares, but at a different time. And no one has ever confirmed this. This is my own thoughts, but I think that was possibly to divert attention. When they set off those flares. I don't know. That's my own thoughts.
Well, the Air Force history on this is actually a history of sin.
Exactly. Yeah.
I think that the best example of this is that when the Condon Report came out in 68. Now, this was the report, basically, where the Air Force had asked the University of Colorado to look into the UFO thing. The report came out in 1968. And the report stated unequivocally that no scientific value had come from UFOs, and furthermore that UFOs had meant nothing to national security. In that very year, there was a sighting at Minot, North Dakota, at the guided missile base there, the Minuteman base. Mm-hmm. And essentially, this UFO had come in and had shut down a whole row of ICBMs.
Right.
If the Air Force was playing by the rules, which of course they never have, then they would have said, oops, obviously our report is in error and so forth. But nobody said much about this at the time, and it didn't come out until much later. And unfortunately, there's a group that has done an extremely thorough investigation of this.
Yes.
And it's online, and you can get it. And they actually interviewed 35 witnesses. The most interesting aspect of this, though, is that the people in Blue Book actually knew about this, and they couldn't speak to the pilots of the plane who had seen the UFO. And the reason that they couldn't speak was they didn't have the necessary clearances.
Oh.
Okay. So here's the ridiculous thing, is that the National Government Investigation Bureau doesn't have the clearances to investigate what is clearly a sighting that indicates a severe threat to national security, and essentially writes it off, and this is the really amazing thing, as ball lightning. What the people in the B-52 saw as they were going over the runway to look at this thing was something 150 feet long and glowing like a miniature sun.
I assure you, swamp gas.
that there's no ball lightning that's 150 feet long and glows like a miniature sun. Okay. Yeah. I mean, it just, I know something about ball lightning. In fact, that was one of the cases I studied.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I've always heard about that, but a lot of times people talk about orbs and things like that. And do you think what is ball lightning? I mean, it's energy, but do you know exactly what it is when you looked into it?
If I could tell you, I would probably get the Nobel Prize. What I can tell you is that about this from a sociological point of view is interesting. And that is that everybody used to think this was a rare phenomenon until they did surveys at 2 national laboratories. And what they found out is that the frequency of people seeing ball lightning sometime in their lifetime was 1 in 20. Okay. This was not a rare phenomenon. This was something that was actually witnessed fairly often. And in one of the presentations that I did, I explained essentially that it was in nobody's interest to report a ball lightning sighting, and especially not in the interest of lightning experts, because they didn't want to look stupid.
Wow. Getting back to why I mentioned to you that I thought things it was based on fear, why people would, or science would suppress. You mentioned about the brontosaurus head and how they didn't want to change all the plaster, castings of that. What essentially is it that makes, let's just talk about science in general.
Sure.
What makes science want to suppress knowledge?
Well, people hate to admit that they've made a mistake. That's reason number one. Reason number two is that they often think that this will give some support to superstition. And superstition is often defined as whatever scientists don't believe, okay? A good example is, paranormal events, okay? And in paranormal events, science essentially has declared, well, paranormal events are just not possible, And in fact, somebody even said ESP is error someplace, okay? Well, now we have very strong evidence from quite a number of different experiments. Dean Raven has done many of them, that in fact, that something is going on which certainly indicates some sort of ability to affect the physical world without directly touching it. But the last thing in the world that science wants to admit is that there is stuff like this that are anomalies that are not under their control. And in fact, the interesting thing, I did a little survey one time on sea serpents, and one of the scientists I interviewed said, he said, I'm sure there are unknown things in the sea, but it can't possibly be what people popularly imagine it to be. Because the idea that somehow the public would be right and science wrong, it's just absolutely unthinkable.
Yeah, and, that's pretty much across the board, I hate to say.
Yes.
Especially when it comes to UFOs. I think Stan Friedman, often says, if that was true, then I should know about it. And that's kind of the attitude that science has a lot of times.
Yes, I refer to it as the fallacy of centrality. And what you just said is exactly the fallacy. It's, if this was going on and I know about it, I would know. I'm sorry,
it makes me think about, quantum entanglement. That's just a good example.
Right.
That is such a baffling thing, when two, I can't remember, not electrons, but whatever it is, they could be light years apart and react exactly at the same time, and they have no answer for why that works. And it's just one of the big mysteries, and it's one that, it shows that something like that happens. Yet when something is paranormal, which to me is along the same lines as that, it's dismissed.
Yes. Well, by the same token, when people talk about UFOs being impossible because nothing can reach us from another star,
right?
It's very interesting when you pose this question to engineers and to and physicists and theoretical physicists. Theoretical physicists will often just sort of laugh at the light being the limiting factor, the speed of light being a limiting factor, and will come up with all sorts of ways you might get around the speed of light. But if you talk to the ordinary physicist about this, the ordinary physicist will say, well, it's clearly impossible. And it's fascinating to see that again, you talk to engineers about this, and they'll start talking about ways that you might do this. So it's even scientists are not necessarily united, but the people you ordinarily talk to are more like the average physicist who just says, well, it's impossible. But if you talk to the people like astrophysicists and so forth, they'll say, well, this could happen in the following ways. So,
yeah, that is, I believe, one of the things that you hear most often is that there's no way that they could live long enough or have enough energy to travel, interstellar. But there are people like Robert Schroeder who has a theory on how that may happen. And there's even, I think it's Dr. White at NASA has been theorizing what's called warp bubbles, which is another way to get around the speed of light. So I think it's possible. It's just that we are thinking with the knowledge that we have now, and who knows what advanced, intelligence could have foreknowledge, and I know they say the laws of physics can't be broken, but the laws that we know about, in my opinion, can't be broken.
Yes, I think that's a very important point. And I think I remember when Edison was busy inventing the electric circuit, there was somebody who was an expert in electricity, and he said, there's no way that Mr. Edison can, break the well-known laws of electricity and so forth. And clearly, Edison had a better understanding of electricity than he did.
Yeah, that's right. And, you talked a little bit about the history of, the suppression. And one of the things, I looked for this on Google a while back, but I couldn't find anything. But I had heard a long time ago, I think when I was growing up, was that there used to be a theory that if you traveled faster than 60 miles an hour, your heart would stop.
Yes, there was a lot of rubbish written about what railroad trains would do to people.
That's
and,
right.
Yes, in fact, so there was a book by a guy named Shrivelbush called The Railway Journey, and it's full of superstitions, and that you can only call them that, about what was going to happen to people if they went too fast. And this was similar garbage was written, about early trains that were going to go faster than 10 miles an hour. So.
Right. Now, in your profession as a professor, have you ever been ridiculed for speaking about UFOs or talking about them?
Everybody in academia who's interested in strange events pays a price for that interest. Roy Mackle, who studied the Loch Ness Monster, was basically told by a member of his department he would never make full professor. Dave Jacobs, who has done some very fine UFO research, has been told basically the same thing, and I'm absolutely sure that how that works. Many of my colleagues have encouraged me to drop my interest in UFOs and the other things that I study for the same reason.
Wow.
And I think probably, fortunately, I'm at a relatively unknown university, and so they're happy of any publicity that I get. So if I were at a major university and doing this stuff, I think it would be the kiss of death.
Okay. How about any colleagues that have a quiet interest in that? Have you encountered that?
Oh, absolutely. One of my colleagues works in a part of the University of Michigan that I won't describe, but suffice it to say is very, very interested and very involved in doing stuff on some part of UFO research that I'm not going to mention, and he absolutely will not let it be known publicly that he has this interest.
Yeah. It's funny. I have a profession that, it's basically in the fine arts and antiques, and I'm known basically for that. And I think I've been at this for about 2.5 years, and every once in a while I'll bring the subject up if I feel comfortable with someone. But there's been 4 people in my business, that have stumbled on my podcast that want to talk to me about their UFO experience that I think is really interesting. And 2 of them have TV shows.
Well, I can tell you one night that I was sitting with 2 of my friends. One of them was a fellow investigator about this, and his wife was sitting next to us. And finally, for whatever reason, his wife pipes up and she said, you've been talking about all these UFO abductions. She said, I want you to know that I'm one of these people you've been talking about. And I just about fell out of my chair.
You're kidding.
I mean, how long did I know these people for? Years, at least a decade.
Well, let's talk about the UFO abduction.
Sure.
Yeah. What do you see about that? I mean, this is something I was on the fence about for a while, and I still find it almost difficult to believe that these thousands of people who are coming forward and saying that they are being abducted that's a tough one to swallow, but something is happening.
Yes, I think that's I don't know the explanation of it. I have some ideas about what it probably is, but I think that this is actually a classic hidden event, because for many, many years, people thought abductions either didn't exist or that there were maybe 1 or 2 in the entire world. And as I wrote in an article one time on hidden events, basically, unless you do a survey, unless you actually go and ask people, you have really no idea. So when we did the big, this is Dave Jacobs, Bud Hopkins, and myself, when we did this big survey trying to understand what was the frequency of people who were abductees in the United States, there were many people who said, there can't be that many abductions, because we suggested that there might be something like 4 million people who are abductees. And lots of UFO folks basically started jumping on our case and said, you're crazy to believe this and so forth. But I can tell you from my own experience that I used to talk about this stuff at parties a lot when I was younger and went to parties. And I don't think I ever went to a party where I talked about this where somebody didn't come up to me, as when things got quiet later on, and said, well, I'm one of these people you were talking about.
Wow.
Okay.
The thing I see about, the thing I see about this that gives it a lot of solidity that something is happening is a lot of people are sort of ashamed to admit it, or, very, very carefully come out about it, because it's something they're really shaken about and nervous to talk about. And that, to me, that gives it more credence that something is going on.
Well, yeah, but so the first thing is that it's indisputable that people have had experiences. Okay, so that's indisputable. But then the question is, all right, could the experience be hallucinatory? Is it the result of mental illness? Is it people's imaginations and so forth? And basically, the thing that we have done, I'm speaking generally here about Bud Hopkins and Dave Jacobs particularly, is that we have gone and we've gotten psychological personnel, psychiatric personnel, and we've examined abductees. None of this other stuff works. Mm-hmm. It just doesn't work. It doesn't explain the events that people had. You take something like the Allagash abduction. Okay, mm-hmm. Here are 4 adult males who, under hypnosis, remember essentially the same sequence of events.
That's right. And that was suppressed from their memory for a good, I think, 4 years or something like that, before they all started remembering it. And,
right.
I had the chance to meet 2 of the 4 last year and sat down and talked with them for a good hour, and actually did an interview with them that I was never able to post because there was too much background noise. But I felt that they were very sincere. And one of the things that amazes me about their particular situation is that each one of them totally changed after that event. And their artwork, they're all artists, and their artwork took a real turn. And one of the abductees actually all of a sudden became brilliant in math and went on to even work with NASA, which is pretty amazing.
That's amazing. I didn't know that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I can't remember his name. He's in New York. One of the 4, one of the brothers, one of the 2 brothers.
Well, I think this is the Allagash abduction is a very striking example, because essentially there isn't any psychological theory that could explain why all of these people would have this event at the same time. And the other interesting thing, of course, is that each of these people, as I recall from reading the book, basically, had some previous life experiences with UFOs and abductions.
Yeah, I did hear that. Yeah, and there's Charlie or Chuck has mentioned that there's still some ongoing things that he has seen and had to happen to him. And I hope Charlie up here. We actually live not really that far away from each other, but he doesn't want to stay up after 8.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's another interesting thing about abductees, is they tend to be day sleepers.
I don't blame them. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this is a very common thing. Abductees are also hypervigilant. That's another tip-off.
Now, you sound like you've done quite a bit of study on this. Have you? What are some other theories that you've come up with?
Well, I think that, frankly, Bud Hopkins and Dave Jacobs, I think I agree with their theory. I mean, I believe that what Jacobs argues about this is very solid. And I've been watching his stuff for years. I mean, I haven't done most of the research personally, but I've kept in touch with these guys over a long period of time. And I think that the difficulty for most of us is it's just too scary. We really don't want to think that this is happening on a broad scale. We certainly don't want to think it's an international event, and that and Hopkins has passed away, which is too bad. But Jacobs, I think, really still feels that what's going on is very much the reason that we see UFOs at all. And frankly, I find his reasoning quite persuasive.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, when I first started doing the show and started talking to people, I had a UFO sighting, and I know that what I saw could not be explained, in a earthly manner. And so right then and there, that changed everything about the way I was thinking. And it actually progressed for me to also think, well, if they're coming here, why are they coming here? And wouldn't, abduction be possible? Because wouldn't we do exactly the same thing if we were exploring, not, say, abduction per se, but at least studying, what life was on, a different planet. And I'm sure that's exactly what we will do eventually when we actually go out there and explore.
I'm not sure, but what I certainly believe about the abduction phenomenon is that the most likely hypothesis for me is that there is some very large machine somewhere in the solar system that's generating a lot of this stuff. That's basically an interstellar intervention vehicle. And the problem is we tend to think about this as, like an experiment or exploration or something like that. But I think this is very clearly an intervention. And I think because it's an intervention, it's something that's highly routinized. I think the grays that people talk about experiencing and so forth are probably some sort of biological robots. They're not particularly smart. But I think this is something that probably has, in fact, a absolutely routine existence, and it's to do a particular kind of thing. And I think what Jacobs thinks it's doing is indeed what this phenomena is all about.
You're not the first one I've heard say about the very same thing about the grays. Very, very similar. We have another question on the message board. Can you comment on any common trend among abductees and whether there might be any new trends?
The person to talk to is Dave Jacobs, and I think I would suggest you that question be addressed to him. What Jacobs has been saying basically is we're seeing more and more abductees essentially helping out what appear to be alien hybrids.
Right.
That's what Jacobs is telling me.
Yeah. You mentioned intervention, and that kind of goes along with some of my thoughts. You mentioned earlier the study of possibly you maybe have been talking about Robert Hastings about the
yes, I am.
UFO and nukes, and
yes,
that's clearly that phenomenon is clearly an intervention. I mean, that's the only thing that really makes sense, shutting down, warheads.
Or in some cases, turning them on.
Right. That's pretty scary.
He's had at least a couple cases, one here and one in Russia, where the launch sequence was actually started by what appeared to be a UFO.
Yeah. That is really scary because that takes it from one extreme to another. One extreme, like they're trying to, give us a wake-up call. And, well, perhaps, arming it is sort of a wake-up call. Look, we can do this type of thing.
I don't think this is about wake-up calls. I really don't. I mean, I think this is what's going on is something where human beings are essentially part of some large process that is going to benefit probably whatever the species is that's behind this stuff.
Mm-hmm. Since the last year and a half, Kepler is out there and discovering all kinds of planets that could possibly, be habitable to life, not necessarily intelligent life, but life. But if you just think about the odds of what the odds would be of intelligent life being out there when there's billions of solar systems, makes me wonder what would make us so special that we would be looked upon for, or what you're saying, and what appears to be happening? What would make us so special compared to all the other planets that have to be out there with intelligent life?
Well, I think the logical thing to believe, essentially, is that whatever the exploration or intervention vehicles are that are doing these things, that they're very good at spotting planets like ours, and probably because of creatures like us that are transformable in some way to the kind of creatures that are the purpose of this whole intervention.
There's another message on the question. Does the guest have any opinion on what the purpose of the hybrids would be?
Yes, I think that is the purpose of what all this is all about. I think that's essentially what's going on. I think the hybrids basically represent some sort of compromise or integration of humans and this other kind of intelligence, and that basically this is probably the intended outcome of the whole intervention in the first place. I think basically we are simply some sort of catalyst or material substrate on which this big intervention is being done.
Wow. It's really something to think about. And, I know that, no one I can speak to really has any real answers, because we really don't know. None of us really know exactly what's going on. But it's an interesting theory. And, I'm not outright saying that you don't know what you're talking about. I'm simply saying that it's a theory. There's a lot of theories. It would be really nice to know someday exactly what is going on. And do you think that that day will come?
As far in the future as possible. Let me tell you something. This phenomenon is extremely frightening to me. Mm-hmm. And I really hope that I'm wrong. I hope Jacobs is wrong. I hope Hopkins is wrong, and so forth. And I would just sleep much better at night if I knew that this was some sort of hallucinatory thing. And in fact, if there were anybody that had a good theory showing it was some sort of hallucination, I would be really happy. I can't explain to you how seriously I take this whole business, and especially given what I know about hidden events. The problem is, if I could just take a moment to talk about this, the big problem is that when we think about stuff like abductions and hybrids and so forth, we tend to revert to common sense. And common sense is great for ordinary life. When we're dealing with things where experience is a good guide, it's excellent. But the problem is, to really deal with the abduction phenomenon, you have to use logic. You have to use complicated reasoning. Your gut is not going to give you the correct answer. And that's the big problem, because we're not very good when it comes to stuff that's not only counterintuitive but also scary.
Wow. I never really looked at it like that. That makes absolute total sense. Now, excuse me. I know that you're friends and with Leslie Kean, or fairly
Yes,
well.
I have enormous respect for Leslie Kean.
Yes, and I do too. And I also think that it's really wonderful to see someone like her. There's been a few other people that have actually looked into the topic seriously, not necessarily journalists, but someone like her gives a lot of credence to the whole thing. And the point I'm trying to get at here is she is always very, she's reluctant to actually come out and say that a UFO has aliens in it. There are
right.
She's very careful about that, and it goes along.
And the irony is that she used to keep company with Bud Hopkins, who,
right.
of course, is probably the world expert on abductions. Yes, go ahead. Sorry.
No, that's right. I think she's just being careful. Because she still has a career as a journalist, and I think she's just being careful. But she's another one, just that points out that we don't really know exactly what's going on, but there is something going on, and...
Yes, and I think this is an interesting thing, and someday I'm going to give a talk about this, that basically, well, let me give you an analogy from another hidden event. The people who discovered the battered child syndrome, when this discovery was publicly announced, let's say 1961.
Pardon me, did you say battered child?
Battered child
okay.
syndrome.
All right, sorry.
They knew perfectly well in doing this that there was a lot of sexual abuse of children. But they intentionally held back that information for 16 years. And the reason they held it back is they wanted the physical abuse stuff to be accepted first.
Oh, jeez.
Okay?
Unreal.
But this is what happened. I mean, and the person who discovered the battered child syndrome, I talked to him, Henry Kemp. He and his whole team knew all about the sexual stuff, but they intentionally held it back because they didn't want to be tarred with the brush of unreality, which later a lot of the stuff, the physical stuff, was described as false memory syndrome.
Now, when you say a battered child syndrome, is it the way someone develops over time? That person.
What happened was in the 1960s, people began to realize that children were being beaten by their parents in much larger numbers than anybody imagined. I mean, we're talking several orders of magnitude here in terms of the suppression of these events. So, radiologists first and pediatricians second got involved in explaining that, hey, there's something going on here, and it's very widespread. And it took years, basically, for Kemp, who was a pediatrician, to get this stuff accepted. And people realized that it wasn't a matter of thousands. It was a question of, probably a couple million people, at least, in the United States, being the subjects of this battered child syndrome. But the interesting thing to me is they had no clue. Even the people who were involved in researching this had no clue how big this problem was. And I think this is the interesting analogy, essentially, with UFOs. So the real question is, how big is this problem? And that's why Bud and Dave and I did this big survey of abductees. Can we find, if we find out, how frequent are abductees in the population? How many of them are there?
So
people didn't like,
this,
by the way, the answers we got.
Pardon me. You've been at this subject a long time, then, if you were actually interacting with Bud. How long have you been active in this?
40 years.
Okay. Wow. That is amazing. I didn't know that. Wow.
And so that's why I did all these studies of things like meteorites and spontaneous human combustion and sea serpents and Bigfoot and so on and so forth, because I wanted to see how these phenomena were treated by science.
Oh, wow. And is ghosts one of those things, too?
It certainly would be, but I just haven't studied it.
Right, yeah. And you mentioned Bigfoot earlier, and again, this is a show about UFOs, but there seems to be a number of UFO sightings related to Bigfoot sightings.
Yes.
And I'm just wondering if...
Particularly in Pennsylvania.
Really?
Yes.
Wow.
Yes, well, Stan Gordon has been looking into this for years. He, I think, was the state director for Pennsylvania for a while. And Stan has written, I think, either 2 or 3 books on UFOs and Bigfoots in Pennsylvania. And his stuff is very good. I mean, he's done a great job. Anybody who's interested in it would be well advised to consult I think one of the books is just called UFOs and Bigfoot or something like that. But when I first heard about this stuff, I thought, well, this sounds like a hallucination and so forth. But if you begin to look at the details of the sightings, it's a very different story.
Right. Now, Ron, I know you're an author. You've written some books. Would you like to talk about what you've written?
Oh, I mean, the books I've written are basically about other sociological things. I wrote a book on the Sidewinder missile team because I read an article in the Wall Street Journal about this little guided missile with good. And so I actually went and interviewed the Sidewinder missile team, and I'm pleased to say the book has gone through 4 printings.
Oh,
and
wow.
must be okay.
Now, have you ever considered writing on the topic of UFOs?
Well, I've written quite a bit on it, actually, but it's all been published in places like the MUFON UFO Journal. And,
Right, yes.
Stuff like that. I haven't done it in the book form.
Uh-huh. Is that something you would explore in the future?
I'm 68 years old. There's only so much time in life. So
well, you wear it well. You certainly don't look it. I met you last year.
Nice.
The thing that I think would be an interesting topic for a book is exactly what we've been talking about, because I don't think anyone has really written on the subject, more or less. Have they?
You mean hidden events?
Yes, and UFOs.
Yes, I will write a book about hidden events, and UFOs will be part of that, because I've done that. That's what I've done basically. I've looked at the psychology and sociology and politics and so on of hidden events, and it's amazing when you begin to put these things up against each other and you begin to see how many similarities there are.
I'll tell you what, that would definitely be a book that I would be very interested in reading, because that subject really fascinates me, but there's no real answer, from what I'm understanding, in why people do it.
Do what?
That they try to keep things hidden. I mean, is it ego and fear, or
Well, there are different issues. One of them is, why don't people report the sightings they have? Okay, and I think we all understand people are likely to be ridiculed. I've had local police officers get well letters from their fellow officers reporting UFO sightings. So that stuff is we can all understand it. In fact, there was a local guy named Frank Manor whose yard was trampled, and people would literally drive into his yard and scream things at his house as a result of some sightings that he had.
Oh, wow.
Then there's another thing. There's the psychology of the newspaper. Why don't newspapers write about UFOs? And I can't go into it right now because it's a complicated subject. But basically, there's a doctoral thesis by Herb Strentz of Northwestern, which is brilliant, about why newspapers don't report about UFOs. And the interesting thing is, the more prestigious the newspaper, the less likely it is to say anything about UFOs.
Wow.
Okay, then we've got another level here where we're dealing with the scientific community. Now, this is an area where I've actually done the most work. And in the case of the meteorite business, I literally spent time reading a lot of 18th century documents to try to find out why it was that science didn't want to see and hear about the meteorites.
Well, I remember Thomas Jefferson said something that they don't exist. There's not, like a rock cannot fall from the sky or something like that.
Well, there's something that he's reputed to have said, that he would rather believe that 2 Yankee professors would lie rather than stones fall from the air. But nobody's ever traced that down. The one thing that he definitely did say was, when somebody had brought to him the evidence of one of the local falls of meteorite, he said, I can tell you the answer in 5 words. He said, it is all a lie.
Oh, wow. We have another question on the message board. Can the guest suggest what it might take sociologically for humans to get past the fear and ridicule?
A smoking gun.
Exactly.
I mean, that's what you need, is something that's, you'd think, well, hey, if they were over the White House, that would be enough. But that happened in 1952, It wasn't enough, okay? So then maybe one of these things landing on a big grassy knoll somewhere in the middle of the city, well, maybe that might do it. But then, we already had the Chicago case, and, O'Hare is the busiest airport in the country, right? Mm-hmm. So, what would it take? I think that unfortunately the kind of thing that it would take is something where I would feel at that moment it might be a little bit too late to do anything. That's what I.
Wow. Yeah. So you really are focused on the fact that you think it's not a good thing?
I don't think it's a good thing at all.
You know,
I mean, I would love to reassure people, and I have to admit there are abductees who like what's happened to them. They constitute, in my opinion, about 5% of abductees, okay? Mm-hmm. Everybody else seems to be absolutely terrorized. Right.
You know, the thing that you hear, like you hear people say, you know, they are benevolent because if they wanted to destroy us, it would be so easy. You know, but like you're saying, it could actually, you know, be for another purpose entirely.
Yeah, this is not about, I mean, obviously they could wipe us out if they wanted to. Mm-hmm. But I think the truth is they have some other use for us. That's what I find scary.
That is scary. I don't think I want to know anymore. And we're just about ready to wrap it up.
Sure.
Do you have I know you have a Wikipedia page. Do you actually have a website?
I'm working on it. No, but if you just put Westrum UFO into Google and see what you get.
Okay.
That's my best advice.
Yeah, that's right. And is someone able to contact you through, say, through email that's posted somewhere?
Well, I'm at Eastern Michigan University, and if you look me up on the university website, basically, and the sociology department, I'm sure you could get my phone number.
All right. Okay, Ron, thanks so much. That's going to be it for today's show. And
my pleasure, Martin.
Yes, thank you very much. And if you missed any part of this show, you can catch it as a podcast and a whole bunch of other podcasts on our website, which is Podcast UFO. Also, you can check out links to our stories and our show notes. I don't think we have too many show notes today. I want to thank everyone for helping out. Our guest, of course, and Keith Rowland, producer of the Dark Matter Radio Network, Andy Fleming for the Astronomy Look, and Carrie Lloyd Whitehouse for the music. I want to thank Peggy Shunning for the wonderful job she does adminning our Facebook page. And remember to like us on Facebook for all the latest UFO and astronomy news. You can check us out live next week right here at the Dark Matter Radio Network and every Wednesday at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And don't forget to jump in the chat room at Podcast UFO. This is Martin Willis saying thanks for listening, and keep your eyes to the sky and your curiosity high.